Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the Cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin, and we're going to be providing an update to the bull market support band. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. Let's go ahead and jump in. So, Bitcoin had a pretty nice move last week, and this is actually something we talked about a lot as we get into sort of the late October seasonality. It was generally expected that Bitcoin was more likely to go up as we got into that third week of October than down. And the reason, I mean, you can go back and watch the video last week, but generally the reason is that a lot of times, sort of mid October or so, Bitcoin starts to pick up a little bit, right? Here's mid October of last year, even in the bear market year 2022, right? Mid October saw some favorable seasonality. 2021, right? Mid October up here. 2020, this was mid October, in this range right here. Bitcoin did well. Even in 2019, right, where Bitcoin went down in Q4, mid October generally was good for Bitcoin, right? I mean, you can see if I zoom in here, um, you can see, I mean, in mid October, the week of October 21st, in fact, Bitcoin rallied 16% from the open to the close. And actually, from the open to the wick high that week, it actually rallied 27%, almost 28%. From the low that it wicked down to, it rallied 45%. So I don't know what it is about mid October, but it does tend to be usually favorable for Bitcoin. So that has come to pass, and it also shows you why the bull market support band can be important sometimes. In some of these cases, especially going into favorable seasonality, you had this move by Bitcoin up, and then we got 3 weekly closes in a row, really 4 in a row, where Bitcoin held the bull market support band. Right? You see that it went up, and then it came back, tested it as support, and then went up. And I said previously that these wicks here don't matter in terms of testing the 20-week SMA, the 21-week EMA, the bull market support band as support. You just want to have weekly closes up here that are above the bull market support band. And if you get that, then it would favorable a move in late October up to the lower high structure. Now, what I said was around 67 to 68K, right? 67 to 68K. But Bitcoin has really already exceeded that. It's actually gone up to about 69.5K or so. Let me see here. The high, yeah, the high already this week is $69,504. And so I don't know how you want to draw this. It probably depends on what you're hoping happens. But if you connect the dots here, right? It depends on which ones you connect, right? If you connect it, and maybe it depends on if you're using a regular scale or a log scale. But let's start off with a regular scale, and connect, say, this data, sort of this wick right here to say these wicks, right? Like, sort of that one, and that one. If you do that, it certainly looks like Bitcoin has sort of made a break for it here, right? You see that? It looks like it's really pushed higher. It still technically is a lower high so far. It needs to take out $70,040, or so, right? So it needs to take out 70K, and ideally get some daily closes up there, if not weekly closes. But if you draw it like that, it certainly looks like it's breaking out from that lower high structure, although it still hasn't put in a higher high yet. If you connect that wick with this one right here from June, you could argue that it still leaves some to be desired. There's some wicks above it right here, but it still really needs to really aggressively make that move. And what's interesting is, you know, I mean, again, last year in October, the week of October 16th, Bitcoin went up 10%. This year, the week of October 14th, Bitcoin went up 10%, right? So this is a really important week, right? And this is a really important week that we're going into right now, because if it follows 2023, then it could be a big move up, right? If it just follows what happened in 2023, which, by the way, I mean, that would be in general, right? In general, it would be in line with what we've talked about in terms of the cyclical nature of Bitcoin, right? If you look at the year-to-date ROI of Bitcoin in halving years, 2016, 2020, 2024, 2012, Bitcoin generally goes up in Q4 of the halving year, right? And then if you also look at Bitcoin as measured from the low, it generally goes up at this point in the cycle, right? You can see that this is when it really starts to move higher. Um, and so that is the cyclical view of Bitcoin. And I've said for months, right, it does not make sense to just say that it can't follow that cyclical view, despite the fact that monetary policy has also played an important part in all of this. If you look at the year-to-date ROI, you can see that monetary policy has had a huge effect on Bitcoin dominance this year. And it's basically made Bitcoin behave in a halving year the way it normally does not behave. In 2024, Bitcoin dominance has basically been going up all year, whereas in 2020 and 2016, you can see that Bitcoin dominance was really struggling for most of the year and only really started to pick back up in Q4. So clearly monetary policy plays an important role in the sort of in the inner workings of the cryptoverse. And the question is, how is this going to play out with the cyclical view of Bitcoin? And I don't think anyone knows the answer to that question. I've told you guys what I do, and I just stick with mostly Bitcoin until Bitcoin dominance is at 60%, because I can't know if Bitcoin's going to break out here. And I can't know. I mean, if it does come back down, there should be, right? I mean, there should be still some time for dominance to get to 60%. One of the interesting things, by the way, if you look at dominance last cycle, like if you overlay Bitcoin dominance with Bitcoin USD, it actually topped 5 weeks after the first rate cut, right? So if you look at the first rate cut, it was the week of July 29th. So if you go to the week of July 29th and go out until dominance topped, it took 5 weeks. What's interesting is, they cut the week of September 16th, and we just started the 5th week. And Bitcoin dominance just hit 59% this past week. So I'm like, is it already time for dominance to go to 60%? I will say, if you look at last year, dominance topped for the year the week of October 23rd, which is basically the week we're going into, right? And on that week, when it topped, it corresponded to a major breakout, right? A major breakout, and then Bitcoin dominance topped, right? It topped at around 54% or so. So is there a chance that that Bitcoin breaks out and then dominance goes to 60% this coming week? It's possible, right? The counterpoint, of course, is that last cycle when dominance topped, it corresponded to QE coming back, and well, it doesn't really seem like that's happening just yet. So I could see it. I mean, I could definitely see it playing out a couple of ways here, right? One way is for the breakout to occur, right? The more decisive breakout, because I don't really feel like it's happened yet. You could still argue that if it just gets rejected here, it was still just a lower high. In 2019, by the way, when the lower high structure was finally taken out, after about 7 months, you can see that Bitcoin rallied, right? It rallied for a few weeks, and then we still got, a pandemic induced recession, and we ended up going back down sort of that initial trend line. And we ended up, seeing Bitcoin basically bottom out there with a wick pretty far down below it. And this structure here is why I told you guys, 7 months ago, expect a 6 to 9 month consolidation, right? 6 to 9 months. It's already been like 7 months, right? So this is around the time that Bitcoin broke through in 2019, right? This is around the time that Bitcoin broke through. Of course, there were more rate cuts on our belt, and QE had already started. So that's the question: is what's more important, the fact that we still haven't had QE yet, or is it just the cyclical component and it's just time, right, for Bitcoin to break out, right? Which is more important? I think that's the question we're about to get answered, right? I think we're about to get that question answered probably this week, right? I mean, if Bitcoin can break out this week, then it looks like it's more of a time-based thing than anything else. That still doesn't mean you won't get a landing. I mean, we still probably will at some point. But the first step was to sort of break through that lower high trend line, right? But if you zoom in there, the high that Bitcoin hit in October 21st, the week of October 21st, was 10,520. And then this high that occurred a few months later, it was 10,514. So it was still technically a lower high, even though it sort of broke through the trend line, right? So that's why, when I say what you would really want to see is to break through $70,040. Right? If Bitcoin can break through that, I think it would go a long way in saying, all right, the lower high structure is behind us, and it's time to just move on with our lives outside of this range. So I think in the short term, if Bitcoin is rejected here, then it's still not even it's still not even at this point, right? It's still not even at this point if it just can get if it just gets rejected here, right? If it can't break through, then you still argue it's part of this lower high trend line that Bitcoin even rallied up to after the rate cut in 2019, right? It rallied up to that sort of that lower high structure, but it was much earlier on in that downtrend. But if it breaks through here, right? If it breaks through, then I think you just argue that we paid our dues, right? We paid our dues, and perhaps it'll just play out like other prior halving years. Remember, Bitcoin doesn't need a reason to go up; it needs a reason to go down. And I think the main thing that could present difficulty would be the labor market, right? And as we've said before, every time that Bitcoin gets up into this range, it comes up into the range about mid to late part of the month, right? You can see it got up in the range late May, sort of the second half of May, sort of the second half of March, and then here it was sort of the second half of July. And then now it's the second half of October. And then it was the following month, once we got the labor market release, that's when Bitcoin then sold off. And so that, I think, is what you have to look for, right? So that's not this week, it's next week, right? So we're not actually going to get the labor market report this week. So I'm curious as to what Bitcoin's going to do this week, right? Is it gonna front run the labor market and just hope that the labor market report is good the following week? In fact, if Bitcoin breaks out, it might imply that the labor market is good the following week. If Bitcoin gets rejected, it would probably imply that the labor market might not be so good. Or it could just be that the market doesn't know and it might just consolidate here. I mean, you can see what happened in July, right? It had a really strong rally, about 12%, and then it didn't go anywhere for a week, right? I mean, it just kind of hung out where it was, and then it was the following week where it got a decision, right? And so that's why I said, if you go back and watch the video last week, I said what's more likely than not to happen in late October is a rally to the lower high structure, and then to pause, and then wait for the labor market data to come in. But I got to be honest with you guys, this move has been stronger, right? It's been stronger than sort of just pausing, right? I mean, you have to be really liberal in how you draw this trend line to say that it hasn't broken out just yet. I mean, I guess you could draw it like that and still say, well, technically speaking, but the reality is you got to be somewhat creative, because there's plenty of ways you could draw this trend line that make it look like Bitcoin's already passed through that structure. I would say what's more important is to just see if it can pass that $70,040 milestone that was the lower high back in July. So this should be a really interesting week. If you go back to 2019 in October, like if you look at October 2019, Bitcoin had this rally, and then the following week it basically just paused, right? And this, by the way, this was somewhat different than what we're seeing today, because this was still within the bull market support band. Today we're already above the bull market support band. So this week, this week right now is a very interesting week, because last year this is the week where Bitcoin really broke through the range, right? I feel like, you had a big move the week of October 16th, but it's not like you can look at it and say that it had broken out, right? There were still some prior highs. And here, the week of October 14th, 2024, you can look back and say, well, technically there's still some highs that haven't been taken out. Just like, this move here, there were still some of these highs that hadn't actually been taken out, right? You see that, right? These highs had not been taken out. And then it was the week of October 23rd, sort of that last week, that last full week of October, where Bitcoin took it out. And that was the week that Bitcoin dominance topped for the year, okay? And remember, last year when Bitcoin broke out, when it topped, if you correspond that to this year, that would be 5 weeks after the first rate cut, which is how many weeks it took last cycle for dominance to top. So we'll see. I'm really curious. My view is this. If Bitcoin can break through here, then there's a good chance that Bitcoin dominance could top as early as this coming week at 60. If it hits 60, that could be it, right? If it gets rejected, right, or if it just stalls out, it might take a month or another month or two for dominance to really top out, right? Like if it just simply gets rejected and can't get a decisive move, because usually what I think it takes is a decisive move, right? It takes, either a big drop or a big rally, right? It takes one of the two to really get Bitcoin dominance moving. And so that's what I would be looking at, and I really don't think you can look at this and just ignore the similarities. Um, I mean, I think the main differences are over here, you were getting slightly higher high. This is a lower high, kind of more in line with what was going on in 2019. So in 2019, after that lower high structure was taken out, then what you had to look towards was that, right? So if you correspond that to 2024, right? If you do believe some of the similarities between 2019 and 2024, then it would be that level right there, right? That is a really important level for Bitcoin to get through. That $70,000. You could argue that if it gets through 70K, right? If Bitcoin, and not just a wick above it, right? If it can really get through it, then it sort of takes away sort of that fear right there, right? That's sort of that double top. And then the unemployment rate sort of exploded higher. Obviously, for other reasons that we would see it explode higher this cycle, but that is still something. And that's the reason why I said 6 to 9 months, right? The reason I said 6 to 9 months was that if you exclude the landing part, you just need about 6 months before you can break through the lower high structure, right? And we already had that. If we get a landing, right? If we get a landing, then it takes about 9 months. So if it takes 9 months, that would actually get you all the way out until, late November, early December. Um, so, again, it's not like I have the answers to what's going to happen with Bitcoin USD. I've been honest with you guys. I think Bitcoin heavy till 60% dominance is just the easiest way to go. And that's what that's what I still that's how I still think about the market, right? I mean, and I do think that if Bitcoin does start to fade, right? If it can't break through this, if it starts to fade, then it'll start to show more of those 2019 similarities. Um, and I think one of the things that is difficult is from a time-based perspective, the 2019 comparison has run its course, right? Again, it's been 6 months, right? It's time, right? It's time. The thing that hasn't necessarily run its course is that when Bitcoin broke out, we had already had 75 basis points of rate cuts and QE, right? Now we don't really have that, right? But there are some, right? There are sort of, what's the word I'm looking for? Like there's things that you can compare Bitcoin to that have already broken out, right? If you look at MicroStrategy, right? I mean, you can look at that, you can see that it already did break out. You see that? I mean, but to be fair, it had already put in a higher high in July, which Bitcoin hadn't done. That's kind of interesting because if you look at MicroStrategy, it had already put in a higher high from May to July. Whereas if you were to overlay Bitcoin onto this chart, it hadn't, right? Bitcoin was a lower high, whereas MicroStrategy was a higher high. So I thought that was kind of interesting when I was looking at that previously, that it played out like that, where one went to a higher high while the other put in a lower high. And so I think MicroStrategy is trying to sort of lead the way, kind of like it did previously, but then it then ended up getting ahead of itself and then having to sort of correct again because Bitcoin wasn't ready to break out, right? It keeps sort of assuming that Bitcoin's ready to break out, and then if it's not, then MicroStrategy has to take an even bigger hit. If it is ready to break out, then obviously the people that hold MicroStrategy were able to front run that. So yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting because like from a time-based comparison, Bitcoin has paid its dues, like 2019. From a monetary policy comparison, right? From a strictly monetary policy comparison, this was 75 basis points. Back in, I think my screen freeze here. Back in 2019, it was 75 basis points of rate cuts and QE for the breakout, right? If you overlay interest rates, 75 basis points and QE. Here we've had 50 basis points of rate cuts, and it's still QT. So, I mean, look, from a investment perspective, obviously people care, right? Like what's going to matter. I just say, look, guys, and no one knows, right? I mean, no one knows, including and especially me. I'll just stick with Bitcoin and hope for the best. But from an academic perspective, just from like being kind of curious from an academic perspective, you know, if it breaks out here, then I think you clearly make the case that it's more of the cyclical component that's more important for USD valuations, and it's the Bitcoin component of altcoins that's more important for monetary policy, right? Monetary policy has certainly affected Bitcoin dominance a lot more than you could argue than it has USD valuations. Here, if Bitcoin can break out, despite the fact that we're still in QT, we haven't even gotten to QE yet. If it can break out, then I think it's more clear evidence that it's more so just a function of the cyclical view of Bitcoin, right? The Q4 favorable seasonality in the halving year and the cycle ROI from the low, right? It's more so a function of that seasonality than it is monetary policy. If for whatever reason Bitcoin gets rejected and people wonder what the hell is going on, then I think you just come back to this and say, well, maybe we need another rate cut, and maybe we need QE in order to get that higher high. I think that's what you would come back to. So that's sort of your, there's always a narrative for price action, right? So I think that would be the narrative if it can't break out. And if it does break out, the narrative is easy, right? If it can't break out, the narrative is easy. It's just, why is everyone trying to overcomplicate something when this is when Bitcoin normally goes up, right? In Q4 of the halving year. If you're new to the channel, you're like wondering, well, what is this? What do I do with this? Guys, I've said before, right? Bitcoin heavy until 60%. I think it's the way to go. A lot of people laughed at that view, but I'd say it's worked out pretty good, especially when you got Bitcoin trading, at like 68K, 69K, and you have a lot of these altcoins much closer to the lows than their highs, right? So all these years later, I think it makes a lot more sense. We're always going to talk about the downside risk on this channel, right? I mean, it's an investing channel. You want to make sure you're considering all perspectives, but monetary policy has been something that we followed, and we'll see here, because I mean, this last week for Bitcoin was a pretty impressive week. It was, right? That was a really impressive week. And it was in line with what we talked about. Favorable October seasonality. Can the favorable October seasonality extend for one more week? Because if it can, then how do you not take out 70K? If it can't, then, we might still be way back over here after the first rate cut and just sort of at a lower high again. But we'll see what happens this week. This should be a really interesting week for the market. And then the following week, the first week of sort of the last sort of part of October going into early November, that'll be the labor market week. Right, that'll be the labor market week. I think, so this is kind of a nuance, right? I mean, I think some people are like, well, how could the market know? I think the market does know, right? And I think it'll tell us this week what, if the labor market report's going to be good or bad. I think the market will probably tell us this week. I think in 2020, when Bitcoin broke through decisively, right, when it broke through the lower high structure decisively, how could it know, right? How could it know that, the whole world was going to shut down, right? And the unemployment rate was going to spike to like 10%, right? You can't blame the market for not knowing that. But if the unemployment rate was actually going to be weak for other reasons, I think the market would have sniffed it out. It didn't sniff it out, and so it broke out. And then you had a black swan. So I would argue that if the market breaks out, it's telling you the labor market report next week is actually not so bad. And if it gets rejected, then maybe there's something to look at a little bit closer during the labor market report next week. Thank you guys for tuning in. Make sure you subscribe, give the video a thumbs up, and again, check out Into the Cryptoverse Premium at intothecryptoverse.com. We'll see you guys next time. Bye.